In the spring of 1942, in the barren heat of the Iranian mountains, a group of Polish soldiers stumbled upon something they never expected to find in the middle of war: a small, orphaned bear cub. The soldiers, part of the newly formed Polish II Corps under British command, had been through hell captured by the Soviets, released under amnesty, and now regrouping in the Middle East before heading to the Italian front. The bear was malnourished, whimpering, and clinging to life. One of the soldiers offered it a can of condensed milk in a rag. The cub accepted, and history began. They named him Wojtek, meaning smiling warrior in Polish, though no one expected him to become more than a mascot. Yet in a time when soldiers were haunted by death, loss, and exile, the bear became a symbol of life. He grew quickly, playfully mimicking the men, drinking from bottles, wrestling in the sand, and following them from tent to tent. Like a loyal dog, what began as novelty turned into something deeper. In a unit of displaced men with no homeland, Wojtek gave them back something they'd forgotten: the comfort of companionship. But the bear wasn't just a pet. As months passed and the Polish Corps trained for combat in the Italian campaign, Wojtek changed. He became stronger, towering over the soldiers, but never hurting anyone. He'd salute when prompted, sit patiently during inspections, and even stand on two legs, mimicking guard duty. At first, British officers thought it was a joke. Then they saw it. Wojtek had discipline. He responded to commands, and the men responded to him. He wasn't a distraction. He was a part of them. By 1943, the II Corps was preparing to ship out to Italy, but a problem emerged. Animals weren't allowed on British military transports. The soldiers refused to leave Wojtek behind. Their solution was as unconventional as the bear himself. They officially enlisted him. On paper, Wojtek became a private in the Polish army, with a serial number, a ranka, and rations. He even had a paybook. British officers raised eyebrows, but they didn't argue. The war had seen stranger things, but none quite like this. When the ship finally departed for Italy, Wojtek boarded with the rest of the soldiers, calm, composed, and wearing a custom-made harness. Other units stared in disbelief. Rumors spread quickly. A bear was going to war. But to his unit, this wasn't absurd, it was right. Wojtek wasn't a mascot anymore. He was a bro in arms. And they would need him more than they knew. They were headed for one of the fiercest battles of the Italian campaign, Monte Cassino. None of them could imagine that this bear, once starving in the desert, would soon carry ammunition under enemy fire and become a legend no one would forget. Italy was cold and wet when the Polish II Corps landed in late 1943. Gone were the dusty Iranian hills and sun-soaked training grounds. Here, the mud clung to boots like concrete, and every distant echo could mean enemy artillery. As Wojtek stepped off the transport ship, his massive paws sunk slightly into the damp earth. British troops watching from a nearby unit stood frozen, whispering in disbelief. The sight of a full-grown bear marching beside soldiers was something they'd never expected. But to the Poles, this wasn't strange, it was family. The soldiers of the 22nd Artillery Supply Company had been through loss after loss. Many had survived Soviet labor camps. Some had no homes left to return to. Wojtek was more than a distraction. He was emotional armor, a walking reminder of survival. He moved freely in the camp, curling up by the tents at night or sitting by the fireside, his breath visible in the cold air. The men shared their rations with him, talked to him like a comrade, and found in his silence a kind of peace words couldn't offer. But Wojtek was also learning. He watched everything the soldiers did, how they lifted crates, loaded trucks, followed orders. When supply drills took place, he followed along, mimicking their actions with uncanny accuracy. He'd rise on his hind legs, grasp boxers of empty shells, and carry them short distances. At first, it was amusing, but then it became clear. Wojtek wasn't playing. He was preparing. Without knowing it, the bear had begun his own training for battle. The officers in command were skeptical. A bear in a war zone. But his behavior silenced most criticism. Wojtek never growled, never attacked. He respected the boundaries of camp life, responded to simple commands, and stood calmly even under the noise of distant shellfire. He had discipline, something many new recruits still struggled with. And perhaps most impressively, he never dropped a crate once he picked it up. That level of control stunned even the most hardened logistics officers. By early 1944, the Second Corps was assigned to support the Allied effort in the attack on Monte Cassino, one of the most brutal, drawn-out battles of the European theater. The men were nervous. Everyone knew what Cassino meant. Relentless German resistance, mountainous terrain, endless artillery, ammunition would be everything. And in the long, dangerous process of resupply, when human hands would shake under fire, Wojtek would find his moment. But none of them could predict just how vital he would become in those deadly days ahead. In a war ruled by steel and fear, it would be a creature of instinct and loyalty that would carry the weight no man expected him to bear. The assault on Monte Cassino began in early 1944 with brutal intensity. The ancient hilltop abbey, fortified by German troops, loomed above the Allied forces like a silent sentinel. The Second Corps was assigned to take one of the steepest sections of the mountain, a near-vertical climb under constant fire. Artillery shells rained down day and night, reducing trees to splinters and men to silence. Among the chaos, in a makeshift supply depot just behind the front line, Wojtek stood watching the soldiers move crates of ammunition, his brown eyes alert, his muscles tense. The air was thick with smoke and the stench of cordite. Trucks brought supplies as close to the front as they dared, but from there it was up to the soldiers and what he had seen the men do this 100 times. Without command, without hesitation, he rose on his hind legs, wrapped his massive paws around a wooden crate of mortar shells, and began walking toward the gun line. A silence fell among the soldiers nearby. One young private dropped his rifle in disbelief. He's doing it," someone whispered. Word spread quickly through the Polish ranks. The bear was helping under fire. Wojtek moved calmly between positions, dodging shell holes, stepping over debris, and delivering crates directly to artillery crews. He never flinched at the sound of gunfire, never dropped a box. Each round he carried meant more time for the gunners to do their job, more pressure on the German line, more hope for an advance. It was an act of instinct, yes, but also of courage. In a war where everything screamed danger, Wojtek listened only to trust. British officers watching from afar were stunned. One major, skeptical of the bear's role, reportedly muttered, "I'll be damned." Before salute, some American troops, initially thinking it was a propaganda stunt, later confirmed his actions in field reports. Wojtek was not just a mascot. He was part of the supply chain, functioning alongside men under the same risks. The bear had become a soldier in every sense of the word. The 22nd Artillery Company, inspired by their unlikely brother-in-arms, fought with renewed determination. They painted a symbol on their transport trucks, a bear carrying an artillery shell. It became their emblem. Even under the most punishing fire, they could glance back and see him towering, silent, steady, doing the impossible without fear. In a battlefield where morale cracked easily, Wojtek held something together that no officer's speech could repair. As the battle for Monte Cassino raged on, Wojtek didn't waver. Each trip back and forth through the danger zone deepened his legend. And though no one said it aloud, the men knew, if the bear could keep going, so could they. He wasn't just carrying crates, he was carrying them. The days at Monte Cassino stretched endlessly, each sunrise bleeding into nights lit only by explosions. Mud-stained everything, boots, bandages, even hope. But amid the chaos, there was one constant: Wojtek's massive frame moving through the smoke, carrying box after box of artillery shells, weaving between craters and barbed wire with a calm that no man could imitate. Soldiers began timing their reloads based on his rhythm. "When Wojtek returns, we fire again," one gunner said with a tired smile. Commanders took notice. Field reports, though cautious, began mentioning the bear by name. Morale has been bolstered by the continued participation of the unit's mascot, one document noted, "Careful not to exaggerate." But within the ranks, there was no doubt Wojtek was essential. Officers who once dismissed him as a distraction now depended on his consistency. He wasn't just helping the supply effort, he was keeping spirits alive. One crate at a time. Back at camp, when the firing paused and exhaustion took over, The men treated Wojtek like a fellow soldier. They washed his fur with buckets of cold water, patched up scratches he got from barbed wire, and even tried to teach him how to salute. Sometimes, when the laughter returned briefly to the camp, someone would joke, "He should have a medal for this." But beneath the laughter, te meant Italiano. In a war where cruelty often overshadowed kindness, Wojtek reminded them of something human, something worth holding on to. Then came a moment that changed everything. An Allied journalist embedded with the Polish Corps captured a photograph of Wojtek balancing a crate in his arms like it weighed nothing. The photo made its way up the chain and, eventually, into British and American newspapers. Public curiosity exploded. Letters from civilians poured in. A bear? Carrying ammunition? Was it true? Was it safe? The answer, from the men on the ground, was always the same. Yes, and he's doing more than most realize. To honor their unlikely hero, the 22nd Artillery Supply Company redesigned their official insignia. A silhouette of a bear carrying an artillery shell. It was painted on their vehicles, stitched onto uniforms, and carved into crates. Wojtek was now not only a soldier, he was the symbol of the company. When trucks passed by other Allied units, soldiers would cheer, recognizing the emblem. They didn't always know the story, but they knew the bear was real. And that alone spread hope. Wojtek didn't understand his fame. He still preferred apples to praise and spent his quiet hours curled beside the fire, surrounded by men who once had nothing and now had each other. As the final push at Cassino approached, no one knew how many would make it out alive. But one thing was certain. If the 22nd was going forward, Wojtek was going with them, silent, strong, and unstoppable. The Polish Second Corps pressed deeper into the Monte Cassino offensive, advancing inch by inch through shell-blasted ridges and rocky mountain trails. Every step forward came at a terrible cost. The air was filled with the deafening thunder of artillery, the sharp crack of rifles, and the haunting silence that followed after an explosion. In the middle of it all, Wojtek kept moving, his massive figure emerging from the smoke, a crate of ammunition in his paws, steady as the mountains themselves. He never showed fear, never turned away. For the men, his presence was more than surreal, it was grounding. As casualties mounted, even the hardest soldiers began to fray. Letters from home arrived slowly. If at all, food grew scarce. The terrain seemed to swallow hope, but Wojtek, oblivious to the politics of war or the cost of strategy, kept to his simple mission: carry, deliver, return. Over and over again. In many ways, he became a mirror for the men. If he could keep going, they had no excuse to give up. In moments when morale buckled, they would say, "Look at Wojtek, still standing. So, we will too." At night, when the guns fell silent for a few precious hours, Wojtek would lie down among the men. He never wandered off. He'd rest his heavy head on a soldier's lap or curl near the fire, letting out low, rhythmic breaths. One night, during a particularly heavy rainstorm, a young corporal placed his wet blanket over the bear instead of himself. "He's carried more for us than I ever could," he said. No one argued. News of the bear's actions continued to ripple through Allied ranks. British, American, and even Italian soldiers began seeking out the unit with the bear. Some came just to see him. Others brought treats, fruit, chocolate, even beer, which Wojtek had learned to drink carefully, bottle in paw. But this was a circus act. He didn't perform for amusement. When strangers came to close, he stood tall and let out a low huff, a gentle but firm reminder. He belonged to the 22nd. Despite the attention, the bond between Wojtek and his unit remained unchanged. He wasn't a pet. He was a soldier. He had been with them through exile, starvation, and now battle. He understood the rhythms of camp life and respected its rules. When orders were shouted, he didn't panic. When gunfire erupted, he stood his ground. And when the wounded cried out, he often lay nearby, silent as if offering presence where medicine could not. As the final push on Monte Cassino approached, the men knew the worst was yet to come. But when dawn broke and they prepared for the advance, there was Wojtek ready, waiting and watching. The bear who once had no home was now at the heart of a brotherhood bound by survival. May 18th, 1944. After months of bloody stalemates and failed assaults, the Allies launched their final offensive to take Monte Cassino. The Polish Second Corps, exhausted but resolute, was chosen to storm the remaining German positions. Before dawn, the soldiers stood in silence, helmets in hand, their breath visible in the cold mountain air. The tension was suffocating. Amid them stood Wojtek, calm and steady, sensing the weight of what was coming. The bear didn't understand tactics or victory, but he understood fear. And still, he didn't flinch. As artillery barrages shook the earth, Wojtek resumed his now legendary role, hauling crates of ammunition from the rear supply lines to the front positions. The terrain had worsened. Slick mud, broken stone, and shattered trees made every step a challenge. Yet he moved with purpose. Soldiers reported seeing him weaving through trenches under fire, dodging shrapnel and ignoring the thunder of German mortar. He moved like he was born for it. One officer wrote, like he believed he belonged there. With every trip, Wojtek earned the awe of the Allied troops. British engineers halted their work just to watch him pass. American medics snapped photographs. Italian partisans whispered prayers, but none were more inspired than the men of the 22nd. Watching him labor, sweat glistening on his thick fur, they fought harder, pushed farther. If a bear could carry the weight of war on his back, so could they. His example became their rallying cry. The battle raged 4 hours. Hillsides were soaked with rain and blood. The Germans, entrenched and desperate, fought fiercely. Casualties were high. But, by midday the Polish flag was raised over the ruins of the abbey. Cassino had fallen. It was a turning point in the Italian campaign, one that came at a tremendous cost. The victory was bittersweet. Too many comrades were lost. The cheers were quiet, subdued by grief. Yet in the middle of the Ruble, standing tall and silent, was Wojtek, mud-caked, weary, and unbroken. After the battle, the High Command acknowledged the 22nd Company's heroism, but among the paperwork and medals, one name kept reappearing: Pribot. Why, he hadn't fired a shot, but he had carried the lifeblood of the battle. Ammunition, he had stood under fire with the same bravery as any man. His actions were noted in dispatches, though not formally decorated, because who could authorize a medal for a bear? That night, as soldiers rested in silence, Wojtek walked between the tents, checking on the wounded. He nudged one man, Isebut, gently sat beside another. The war wasn't over, but they had survived Cassino, and they owed it, in part, to the soldier who never spoke, never questioned orders, and never stopped carrying the weight of his brother's lives, one crate at a time. After Monte Cassino, the Polish Second Corps continued its push north through Italy. The terrain changed. Olive groves replaced craters. Quiet villages replaced trenches, but the war did not ease. German resistance remained fierce, and supplies were always stretched thin. Wojtek, however, adapted without complaint. Wherever the 22nd Artillery Company went, he followed, riding in supply trucks, resting in muddy fields, and, when needed, carrying crates with the same steady determination as always. But something else had changed. Now, everyone knew his name. He was no longer just a unit mascot, he had become a symbol. Allied newspapers across Europe had picked up his story, dubbing him the Soldier Bear. Photos of him lifting crates and standing among troops circulated widely. In London, a British general reportedly remarked, "If only all our men had such discipline." Children in refugee camps wrote letters addressed to Wojtek the Brave, and donations of fruit and honey arrived from civilians who had never met him but considered him part of their victory. Despite the fame, Wojtek remained unchanged. He still wrestled with his handlers, stole cigarettes from unattended bags, and gently borrowed food when no one was looking. Yet on the field, he was disciplined, dependable, and respected. New recruits were often told, "If the bear trusts you, you're one of us." That kind of trust couldn't be earned with rank or medals, it had to be proven. And for Wojtek, it always came down to loyalty. But fame brought complications. Military bureaucracy, confused by his growing legend, began to question how a bear had been enlisted. Rumors surfaced that higher command might reassign him to a zoo or remove him from active duty altogether. The men of the 22nd were outraged. To them, Wojtek wasn't a novelty. He was a comrade. When questioned by Allied inspectors, one Polish officer simply replied, "He carries more ammunition than most of our drivers. Let him stay." The solution came in a clever stroke of paperwork. Wojtek was officially promoted to the rank of private and given a serial number. He was, by military records, a soldier like any other. It was an unusual entry in the army rolls, but no one dared argue. His status ensured he could stay with the unit, continue to travel with them, and, most importantly, be protected from being removed. Wojtek had earned his place, and now it was permanent. By the summer of 1944, as the Allies gained ground and the tide of war began to shift, Wojtek stood not just as a symbol of strength, but of unity in a world divided by borders, ideology, and destruction. Here was a creature who asked for nothing and gave everything. His legend was only growing but to the men who marched beside him. He would always just be Wojtek, their brother, their bearer, their bearer. As the Italian campaign neared its end, the Polish II Corps pushed northward through the Apennine Mountains, joining the broader Allied effort to liberate Italy. The war's momentum had shifted. German defenses were crumbling, and surrender felt inevitable, but the cost was still steep. Ambushes, air raids, and final desperate offensives claimed lives daily, and yet, through it all, Wojtek remained with his brothers, his large frame now more recognized than many generals. Soldiers from other units saluted him with a mix of respect and disbelief. With each village liberated, children would rush out to greet the approaching Polish trucks, only to freeze in awe when they saw a bear sitting calmly in the back, beside men in uniform. Wojtek had become more than a mascot. He was a living symbol of hope, loyalty, and resilience. His story was whispered in foxholes and carried across borders. To the men of the 22nd, it was strange to hear others talk about him like a legend when they knew he still snored loudly at night and tried to sneak into tents for extra rations. The end of the war brought new complications. As Germany fell and peace approached, questions rose about what would happen to the bear. The Polish troops had no homeland to return to. Poland had fallen under Soviet control. Many soldiers refused to go back, fearing persecution. Wojtek, too, was now without a nation. He had marched, carried, and served alongside men whose futures were as uncertain as his. What would become of a bear who had fought like a man? In July 1945, after the official German surrender, the 22nd was stationed in southern Italy awaiting orders. One morning, the unit was told they would be transferred to Scotland for demobilization. The news was bittersweet. The war was over, but their brotherhood, forged in fire and blood, would soon be scattered. As trucks rolled out toward the port, Wojtek was among them, sitting tall, his eyes calm. He didn't understand what was coming, only that he would not leave his unit behind. Upon arrival in Scotland, the 22nd was assigned to a camp near Winfield in Berwickshire. The cold air was a harsh contrast to Italy's sun, but Wojtek adjusted quickly. British villagers were shocked to see a bear strolling alongside Polish troops in full uniform. Children followed him with apples, and local papers covered his arrival as if royalty had come to town. Even so, Wojtek remained humble, if a bear could be called that. He still helped carry supplies, still guarded the camp like a sentinel, and still laid beside the men he loved. As autumn set in, one thing became clear. Wojtek's war was over, but his story was far from finished. The bear who had marched from Persia to Italy, carried crates under fire, and stood shoulder to shoulder with soldiers, now faced the hardest part of any war story: what comes after the battle is done. The Polish 22nd Artillery Supply Company was gradually disbanded as 1946 approached. Veterans who had fought together through deserts and mountains now faced new battles, uncertainty, and the struggle to build a life in lands not their own. Wojtek watched the men leave in small groups. At first, he waited by the gates of the Scottish camp as each truck disappeared into the mist. Over time, the crowd grew thinner, the laughter quieter. He was still a soldier, still standing guard, but his unit was vanishing. The Polish soldiers had wanted Wojtek to come with them wherever they went, but few had homes, let alone places suitable for a 500-pound bear. The British authorities sympathetic but bound by law, had to find a permanent solution. After long discussions, the decision was made: Wojtek would be transferred to the Edinburgh Zoo, where he could live in safety, close to his old comrades who had settled nearby. It was a compromise far from the wild, but also far from forgotten. The day of his departure was quiet. A small group of former soldiers escorted him to the zoo gates. There were no medals, no speeches, only silent handshakes and heavy eyes. As the gates closed behind him, Wojtek looked back once, then walked forward. He didn't roar, didn't resist. He had followed orders his entire life. Now there were no more commands, just fences, curious visitors, and the echo of a war that had moved on without him. But Wojtek never became just another zoo animal. His story followed him. Former soldiers visited often, bringing treats, cigarettes, beer, fruit, and standing by his enclosure for hours, telling stories to anyone who'd listen. Some would quietly whistle the marching songs of the 22nd. When Wojtek heard them, he'd stand on his hind legs and look toward the crowd, recognizing something only he and those men truly understood. He had been one of the men. They never let the world forget it. Over the years, thousands came to see him. Children tugged at their parents' coats, pointing in wonder. Tourists posed for pictures. Reporters retold his story again and again. The bear who carried ammunition in the heat of battle. But for the few who had marched with him, it wasn't just a tale. It was memory. It was survival. Wojtek was living proof of what they had endured and what they had overcome. Yet, even surrounded by admiration, Wojtek began to slow. His fur grayed. His steps grew heavy. The playful spark that once drove him to wrestle with grown men now flickered quietly in his eyes. But when a familiar voice called his Namor, when an old soldier came to visit, he would lift his head, rise with effort, and press his paw gently against the glass. He couldn't speak. He didn't need to. In that momenta he was still Private Wojtek, still a brother in arms. In the winter of 1963, the winds over Edinburgh carried a quiet sorrow. At the age of 21, after years spent in peaceful captivity, Wojtek Private Wojtek of the Polish the Second Corps passed away. The zoo reported it simply: natural causes, age, wear of time. But for those who knew his story, it felt like the end of a chapter much bigger than one bear. The passing of Wojtek marked the fading breath of a generation that had fought, survived, and carried the impossible across continents. News of his death echoed far beyond Scotland. Polish veterans held quiet tributes across the UK. Newspapers in London, Warsaw, and New York published memorials. One British columnist wrote, "He never spoke a word, but he told the story louder than most men ever could." Children who had once visited him now brought their own to see the empty enclosure. But it wasn't just about seeing a bear, it was about remembering what loyalty, courage, and sacrifice truly looked like. In the years that followed, Wojtek's legacy only grew. Sculptors carved statues in his honor, first in Edinburgh, then in Krakow, then in London. Streets were named after him, and books written for new generations. His story was taught in classrooms, not as myth, but as fact. A bear, once orphaned in the Iranian mountains, had marched with men through the deserts of the Middle East, climbed the deadly heights of Monte Cassino, and helped liberate Europe one crate at a time. For the veterans of the 22nd, Wojtek was never just a symbol. He was a comrade, a silent listener to their fears, a guardian of their lives, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, strength could come from the most unexpected places. Many of those men never returned to Poland, but wherever they settled, they carried Wojtek's memory with them as proof that dignity could survive war, even when nations fell. And for the world, Wojtek became something deeper. In a century defined by destruction, he stood as a testament to the human spirit and the animal one, too. He had no voice, no uniform that fit quite right, no medals pinned to his fur, but they surveyed willingly, faithfully, without hesitation. In doing so, he taught us that war is not just about violence or borders, but about the quiet, loyal acts that bind soldiers together. Today, visitors still gather at Wojtek's statues, some leaving flowers, others saluting. Children ask their parents, "Was it real?" And the answer is always yes. Wojtek was real. His courage was real. His story is not a fable. It's a piece of history carried not in words but in the hearts of those who believe that even in war, kindness and loyalty can march beside the strongest soldiers. And sometimes they walk on four legs.